The Holy Roman Empire, a sprawling and often perplexing entity, did not spring fully formed from the earth, but was instead forged in the crucible of a fragmented Europe, its genesis inextricably linked to the towering figure of Charlemagne in the late 8th century. Imagine, if you will, the twilight of the Roman Empire in the West, not as a sudden collapse, but as a slow, agonizing twilight, leaving behind a patchwork of nascent kingdoms, tribal federations, and the lingering ghosts of a once unified world. For centuries after the last Western Roman emperor was deposed in 476 AD, the idea of a universal Christian empire, a successor to Rome, flickered in the minds of many, the dream of order amidst the swirling chaos of the so-called Dark Ages. It was into this volatile landscape that Charlemagne, King of the Franks, strode, a man of immense ambition and strategic brilliance. His Frankish kingdom, by the late 700s, had already grown to encompass much of modern-day France, Germany, and parts of Italy. He was a conqueror, yes, but also a reformer, a patron of learning, and a devout Christian who saw himself as a protector of the church. His campaigns were relentless, against the Lombards in Italy, the Saxons to the east, and the Avars in the Danube basin. Each victory expanded his dominion, weaving together disparate peoples and cultures under his formidable rule. One could almost hear the clang of swords echoing across the plains, the murmur of prayers rising from newly built monasteries, and the whispers of scholars poring over ancient texts in his court at Aachen. Then came the pivotal moment, Christmas Day of 800 AD. Charlemagne, having journeyed to Rome to support Pope Leo III against his accusers, knelt in prayer in St. Peter's Basilica. As he rose, the Pope, unexpectedly perhaps, placed a crown upon his head, proclaiming him Emperor of the Romans. This act, rich in symbolism and fraught with future implications, immediately resurrected the imperial title in the West after more than 3 centuries. Historians still debate the exact circumstances and Charlemagne's true feelings about this coronation. Was it a surprise, as his biographer Einhard claimed, or a carefully orchestrated event? Regardless, it marked a profound shift, establishing a new political and spiritual authority that would endure in various forms for over 1,000 years. This new empire, though it consciously evoked the grandeur of Rome, was fundamentally different. It was a Christian empire. Its legitimacy derived from both military might and papal sanction, deeply intertwined with the Church in a way the pagan Roman Empire never was. Charlemagne's reign, often called the Carolingian Renaissance, was a period of remarkable cultural and intellectual flourishing. He standardized coinage, reformed the legal system, and crucially, promoted education. Monasteries became centers of learning, meticulously copying ancient manuscripts, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost to time. Imagine the quiet cloisters, illuminated by flickering candlelight, where monks painstakingly transcribed Latin texts, their quills scratching across parchment, ensuring that the wisdom of antiquity would not vanish entirely. This intellectual revival, though modest by later standards, laid some of the groundwork for future European development. However, Charlemagne's empire, for all its splendor, was ultimately a personal creation, held together by his formidable will and charisma. Upon his death in 814, the vast realm began to unravel, a process hastened by Frankish tradition of partible inheritance, where a father's lands were divided among his sons. His only surviving legitimate son, Louis the Pious, struggled to maintain unity. The empire, too vast and diverse, with nascent cultural and linguistic differences already emerging, proved difficult to govern as a single entity. The Treaty of Verdun in 843, signed by Charlemagne's three grandsons, formally partitioned the Carolingian Empire into three distinct kingdoms: West Francia, Middle Francia, and East Francia. This division, though intended to bring peace, instead laid the foundation for future conflicts and the eventual emergence of separate French and German identities. It was in East Francia, the easternmost portion of Charlemagne's fragmented legacy, that the seeds of the Holy Roman Empire, as we generally understand it, truly began to germinate. This region, encompassing much of modern-day Germany and parts of Central Europe, was a volatile frontier, constantly battling Viking raids from the north, Magyar incursions from the east, and internal struggles among powerful dukes. The Carolingian line here eventually faltered, and in 919 the German dukes elected Henry the Fowler, Duke of Saxony, as their king. This marked a crucial shift. The monarchy became elective rather than strictly hereditary, a characteristic that would define the Holy Roman Empire for much of its existence. Henry's son, Otto I, known as Otto the Great, truly cemented the foundations of the future empire. Otto was a military genius, famously defeating the Magyars at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955, a victory that not only secured his eastern borders, but also earned him immense prestige as a defender of Christendom. He skillfully leveraged the church, appointing bishops and abbots to administrative positions, thereby creating a loyal and educated bureaucracy that could counterbalance the power of the unruly secular nobility. This close alliance between secular power and ecclesiastical authority, though beneficial in the short term, would also become a source of profound conflict later in the empire's history, particularly during the Investiture controversy. Like Charlemagne before him, Otto harbored imperial ambitions. He intervened in Italian affairs, restoring Pope John XII to his see after he had been deposed by a Roman faction. In gratitude, or perhaps out of necessity, Pope John XII crowned Otto emperor in Rome on February 2, 962. This event is widely considered the true birth of the Holy Roman Empire, marking the formal re-establishment of a Western empire with a distinct German character, though it continued to claim the mantle of Rome. This new empire, often referred to as the Ottonian Empire in its early phase, was not a direct continuation of Charlemagne's, in the sense of a seamless dynastic succession across the entire former Carolingian realm. Instead, it was a rebirth, a conscious effort to revive the imperial ideal, rooted in the lands of East Francia and bound by a unique relationship with the papacy. The name itself, Holy Roman Empire, is a fascinating and somewhat anachronistic construction. The term holy was not formally added until the 13th century, reflecting the empire's deep connection to the Church and its perceived divine mandate. The Roman aspect, too, was more aspirational than literal. Unlike the ancient Roman Empire, this new entity was not centered on Rome, nor did it directly control the vast territories of its predecessor. It was rather an empire of ideas, a spiritual and political successor that sought to embody the universal Christian ideal. A protector of the faith and a guarantor of order in a still turbulent Europe. One of the enduring mysteries surrounding the early Holy Roman Empire is the extent to which its emperors truly aimed to recreate the centralized power of ancient Rome. While they adopted Roman titles and symbols, the reality on the ground was far more fragmented. The empire was a loose confederation of duchies, bishoprics, and free cities, each with its own customs, laws, and degrees of autonomy. The emperor's power often depended more on his personal landholdings and alliances than on any inherent imperial authority. This tension between the universal aspirations of the imperial title and the decentralized reality of its constituent parts would be a recurring theme throughout its thousand-year history. The early emperors from Otto I through his successors Otto II and Otto III dedicated considerable energy to asserting their authority over Italy, a land rich in symbolic importance due to its connection to ancient Rome and the papacy. Otto III, in particular, was deeply influenced by classical Roman and Byzantine ideals, even attempting to establish Rome as the true centre of his empire. He built a palace on the Aventine Hill and surrounded himself with scholars and artists, dreaming of a renovatio imperii Romanorum, a renewal of the Roman Empire. Yet, these ambitious plans often clashed with the realities of Italian politics and the growing independence of the German princes. His early death in 1002, without an heir, brought an end to his grand vision, and the focus of the empire shifted back north to the German lands. The fragmentation that followed Charlemagne's death and the subsequent rise of the Ottonian dynasty illustrate a fundamental characteristic of the Holy Roman Empire: its continuous struggle between unity and diversity, between centralized imperial power and the centrifugal forces of local autonomy. Unlike the more unified monarchies that were emerging in France and England, the Holy Roman Empire remained a complex tapestry of semi-independent states, bound together by a shared imperial ideal and the person of the emperor, but often pulled apart by regional interests and dynastic rivalries. This unique political structure, often described as a sacred monster or a state that was not a state, would be both its strength and its ultimate weakness. The early centuries of the empire were thus a period of constant negotiation and redefinition. Emperors sought to legitimize their rule through coronation by the Pope, yet simultaneously asserted their right to control ecclesiastical appointments within their own territories. This delicate balance, this dance between secular and spiritual authority, would become a defining feature of the Holy Roman Empire, setting it apart from other European powers. The very act of coronation in Rome, a journey fraught with peril and political maneuvering, underscored the unique dual nature of the imperial office, a temporal ruler blessed by the spiritual head of Christendom. The cultural legacy of this early period, though often overshadowed by the later grandeur of the High Middle Ages, was profound. The Ottonian emperors, like their Carolingian predecessors, were patrons of the arts and sciences. Ottonian art, with its distinctive blend of late Carolingian, Byzantine, and early Romanesque influences, produced magnificent illuminated manuscripts, intricate ivory carvings, and monumental architecture, particularly in the construction of cathedrals and monasteries. These artistic endeavors were not merely aesthetic, but served to reinforce the imperial ideology, depicting emperors as divinely appointed rulers, successors to both Roman and biblical kings. Imagine the vibrant colors of a gospel book, its pages adorned with gold leaf and intricate illustrations, telling stories of salvation and imperial power. A testament to the intellectual and artistic fervor of the time. The political landscape of Europe was still very much in flux during these centuries. The Byzantine Empire in the East continued to thrive, a direct heir to the Roman tradition, often viewing the Western emperors with a mixture of disdain and grudging respect. The emerging kingdoms of France, England, and the various Slavic states to the east were developing their own distinct identities, often clashing with the Holy Roman Empire over territorial claims and spheres of influence. The empire, therefore, was not an isolated entity, but a central player in a complex geopolitical game, constantly adapting to shifting alliances and emerging threats. Its very existence, a revival of the Roman ideal in a Christian guise, was a testament to the enduring power of historical memory and the human desire for order and universal meaning. The seeds sown by Charlemagne and nurtured by Otto the Great would grow into a sprawling, often contradictory, but undeniably influential political entity. It was an empire built on an idea, a spiritual aspiration as much as a territorial reality, a complex interplay of power, faith, and tradition that would shape the course of European history for centuries to come. The initial fragmentation after Charlemagne's death, far from destroying the imperial ideal, instead allowed it to be reimagined and rerouted in a new context, setting the stage for a truly unique political experiment. If you're enjoying this, make sure to subscribe and leave in the comments the time and place you're listening from. The last echoes of Charlemagne's dream had faded into the fragmented landscapes of the former Carolingian Empire. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 had carved his vast dominion into three, and subsequent divisions further splintered the realm. In the easternmost of these divisions, a new power was slowly coalescing, almost unnoticed by those still clinging to the ghost of Roman grandeur. This was a land of duchies: Saxony, Bavaria, Swabia, Franconia, and Lotharingia, each with its own proud identity and powerful dukes, often at odds with one another. Yet, from this tapestry of local loyalties, a new force was about to emerge, one that would attempt to rekindle the flame of empire, not as a mere imitation, but with a distinct Germanic character. It was in Saxony, a region known for its fierce independence, and a people only recently brought into the Christian fold by Charlemagne himself, that the foundations of this new era were laid. Henry I, Duke of Saxony, known as Henry the Fowler, was elected King of the East Franks in 919. His ascension marked a crucial turning point, for he was the first non-Frankish king of this realm. Henry was a pragmatic and capable leader, more concerned with securing his borders and consolidating his power than with grand imperial ambitions. He faced constant threats from the Magyars, nomadic horsemen who raided deep into Central Europe. And from the Danes to the north, Henry understood that to defend his kingdom, he needed a strong, unified force, and he began the arduous task of building a network of fortified towns and a more effective cavalry. He famously defeated the Magyars at the Battle of Ryda in 933, a victory that bought his kingdom a crucial respite and cemented his authority. But it was Henry's son, Otto I, who truly breathed new life into the imperial idea. Otto, who succeeded his father in 936, possessed a vision that extended far beyond the borders of Saxony. He was crowned in Aachen, Charlemagne's old capital, deliberately evoking the memory of the great emperor. This was no accident. Otto saw himself as Charlemagne's spiritual successor, destined to restore order and lead Christendom. His early reign, however, was fraught with challenges. The powerful dukes, accustomed to their autonomy, chafed under his assertive rule. Otto spent years suppressing rebellions, often led by his own brothers and sons, a testament to the turbulent nature of feudal politics. He learned early on that relying solely on the loyalty of secular magnates was a precarious strategy. This realization led Otto to a brilliant and enduring innovation: the strategic elevation of the church. Unlike his Carolingian predecessors, who had used the church as a partner, Otto began to integrate it directly into the machinery of government. He appointed bishops and abbots not just for their spiritual qualities, but for their administrative skills, and crucially, for their loyalty to the crown. These ecclesiastical appointments, unlike secular lordships, did not pass down through hereditary lines. When a bishop died, his lands and offices reverted to the king, allowing Otto to maintain control and prevent the accumulation of dynastic power that had plagued previous rulers. This system, often called the Ottonian church system or the Imperial church system, became a cornerstone of Ottonian power, providing the emperor with a loyal, educated bureaucracy and a vast network of resources. These churchmen, often chosen from the royal chapel, were not just spiritual leaders, they were judges, administrators, and even military commanders, wielding both crozier and sword in service of the emperor. Otto's ambitions were not confined to his eastern Frankish kingdom. Like Charlemagne before him, he looked south to Italy. The political situation there was a chaotic tangle of competing claims and weak rulers. In 951, responding to a plea from Queen Adelaide, who was imprisoned by a rival claimant to the Italian throne, Otto led his army across the Alps. He rescued Adelaide, married her, and declared himself King of Italy. This move established a direct link between the German monarchy and the Italian peninsula, a connection that would define the Holy Roman Empire for centuries to come, often with profound and bloody consequences. The most significant event of Otto's reign, however, occurred in 962. After once again intervening in Italy to restore order and protect the papacy, Otto was crowned emperor by Pope John XII in Rome. This moment is widely regarded as the traditional founding date of the Holy Roman Empire, a distinct entity from the earlier Carolingian Empire, though consciously drawing upon its legacy. The title of Holy Roman Emperor was not merely honorific. It conferred upon Otto a unique spiritual authority, making him the protector of the Church and the leading secular ruler of Christendom. This coronation established a precedent that would bind German kings to Italy and the papacy for centuries, creating a complex and often contentious relationship between secular and spiritual power. The Ottonian Renewal was not just about political and military might, it was also a cultural and intellectual blossoming. Under Otto I and his successors, particularly Otto III, there was a conscious effort to revive classical learning and artistic production, often referred to as the Ottonian Renaissance. Monasteries, supported by imperial patronage, became centers of scholarship, copying ancient manuscripts and producing magnificent illuminated texts. The arts flourished, particularly in metalwork, ivory carving, and architecture. The construction of grand cathedrals and churches, often in a monumental Romanesque style, showcased the wealth and power of the empire and its close ties to the church. The famous bronze doors of Hildesheim Cathedral, commissioned by Bishop Bernwood, a close advisor to Otto III, are a stunning example of Ottonian artistry, depicting scenes from the Bible with remarkable detail and emotional depth. Otto I's reign was a period of consolidation and expansion. He decisively defeated the Magyars again at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955. A victory that effectively ended their raids into Western Europe and secured the eastern borders of his empire. This triumph, often celebrated as a pivotal moment in European history, cemented Otto's reputation as a savior of Christendom and further enhanced his imperial prestige. He also expanded his influence eastward, establishing marches and bringing Slavic tribes under his sway, laying the groundwork for the future eastward expansion of German power. The relationship between the emperor and the pope, however, was always a delicate dance. While Otto I had been crowned by the pope, he also asserted his authority over the papacy. He deposed Pope John XII for disloyalty and appointed his own candidate, demonstrating the emperor's considerable power over the church, at least in the early stages of the empire. This assertion of imperial control over papal appointments would become a major point of contention in later centuries, leading to bitter conflicts like the Investiture controversy. Otto II, who succeeded his father in 973, inherited a vast and powerful empire, but also its inherent complexities. He was a highly educated ruler, fluent in Greek and Latin, and deeply interested in the intellectual currents of his time. His reign was marked by continued efforts to consolidate imperial authority in Italy and to expand southward, often clashing with the Byzantine Empire and the Saracens, who controlled parts of southern Italy. He married Theophanu, a Byzantine princess, a union that brought a sophisticated Eastern influence to the Ottonian court and further emphasized the imperial ambitions of the dynasty. However, his campaigns in southern Italy were ultimately unsuccessful, culminating in a devastating defeat by the Saracens at the Battle of Stillo in 982, from which he barely escaped with his life. He died shortly after, in 983, leaving his 3-year-old son Otto III as emperor. The minority of Otto III was a precarious period. His mother, Theophanu, and later his grandmother Adelaide, skillfully governed as regents, maintaining the integrity of the empire despite challenges from ambitious nobles. Otto III, when he came of age, was a fascinating and enigmatic figure. Steeped in both Western and Byzantine traditions, he dreamed of a universal Christian empire. A renovatio imperiae Romanorum, a renewal of the Roman Empire, with Rome as its spiritual and political heart. He spent much of his short reign in Italy, attempting to establish Rome as the true capital of his empire, rather than a Germanic city. He surrounded himself with scholars and sought to revive classical Roman customs and ceremonies. He even appointed his former tutor, Gerbert of Aurillac, as Pope Sylvester II. A brilliant scholar who shared Otto's vision of a revitalized empire. Otto III's reign, however, was ultimately a tragic one. His grand vision of a universal empire, centered in Rome and ruled by a German emperor in close partnership with the Pope, proved impractical. His constant presence in Italy alienated the German nobility, who felt neglected, and his attempts to assert imperial authority in Rome often met with resistance from the local populace. He died suddenly in 1002, at the age of 21, without an heir, bringing an end to the direct Ottonian line. His death plunged the empire into a succession crisis, and his ambitious plans for a renewed Roman Empire largely dissolved. Historians still debate the true nature of Otto III's vision. Was it a realistic attempt to re-establish a truly universal empire, or a romantic, perhaps even naive, dream of a young, highly intellectual emperor? Some argue that his focus on Rome and neglect of his German power base ultimately weakened the empire, while others see him as a visionary who anticipated later movements towards a unified Europe. Regardless, his reign stands as a testament to the enduring power of the Roman imperial idea, even centuries after its fall. The Ottonian period, though relatively brief, laid the essential groundwork for the Holy Roman Empire. It established the unique dual nature of the empire, linking German kingship with the imperial crown and the protection of the papacy. It solidified the imperial church system, a powerful administrative tool that would serve emperors for centuries, though it would also become the source of immense conflict. The Ottonians revived learning and the arts, fostering a distinct cultural identity that blended Germanic traditions with classical and Byzantine influences. Their legacy was one of ambition, innovation, and a constant struggle to balance diverse regional loyalties with the unifying ideal of empire. The seeds of future conflicts, particularly between the emperor and the pope, were sown during this era, but so too were the foundations of a powerful and enduring political entity that would shape the course of European history for nearly a millennium. The echoes of their triumphs and struggles would reverberate through the halls of power in Germany and Italy for generations to come, a constant reminder of the delicate balance required to hold such a vast and disparate realm together. The year 962 had seen Otto I crowned emperor, a momentous event that rekindled the imperial flame in the West. Yet it also ignited a slow-burning fuse that would eventually lead to centuries of conflict. For the newly established Holy Roman Empire, the relationship with the papacy was a double-edged sword. On one hand, papal coronation lent immense spiritual legitimacy to the emperor, elevating his status above other European monarchs. On the other, it entangled the emperor in the often turbulent affairs of the church, particularly concerning the appointment of bishops and abbots. This struggle, known as the Investiture controversy, would become the defining crisis of the High Middle Ages for the empire, shaping its internal dynamics and its very place in the European tapestry. In the early decades of the empire, the Ottonian and Salian emperors, recognizing the immense power and wealth held by ecclesiastical offices, had actively sought to control these appointments. Bishops and abbots, often drawn from the imperial court or loyal noble families, were not merely spiritual leaders. They were powerful landholders, military commanders, and administrators who owed their fealty directly to the emperor. They provided troops for imperial campaigns, counsel for imperial policy, and revenue for the imperial treasury. This system, often called the Ottonian Salian imperial church system, was a cornerstone of imperial power, allowing the emperors to counterbalance the often unruly secular nobility. The emperor would invest a newly appointed bishop or abbot with the symbols of their office, a ring and a crozier, signifying their spiritual authority, but also with a scepter, representing the temporal lands and rights granted by the emperor. This practice blurred the lines between spiritual and temporal authority, making the church a de facto arm of the imperial administration. However, a powerful reform movement was stirring within the church itself, advocating for greater spiritual purity and independence from secular control. Cluny, a Benedictine monastery founded in Burgundy in 910, became a powerful symbol and engine of this reform. Cluniac monks championed ideals of monastic discipline, papal supremacy, and freedom from lay interference in church affairs, including the appointment of clergy. This movement gained momentum throughout the 10th and 11th centuries, finding its most fervent champion in Hildebrand, who would later become Pope Gregory VII. Gregory VII, a man of fierce conviction and unyielding will, ascended to the papacy in 1073. He was determined to assert the spiritual authority of the Pope over all secular rulers, including the emperor, and to end the practice of lay investiture. For Gregory, the emperor's appointment of bishops was a sacrilege, a corrupting influence that undermined the spiritual integrity of the Church. He believed that only the Pope, as the successor of St. Peter, had the authority to appoint and depose bishops. In 1075, Gregory issued a decree unequivocally condemning lay investiture, a direct challenge to the very foundation of imperial power. The reigning emperor at the time was Henry IV, a young and ambitious ruler who had inherited the throne at a tender age and had spent his early years struggling to assert his authority over rebellious Saxon nobles. He understood that surrendering the right to appoint bishops would cripple his power, leaving him vulnerable to both internal and external threats. Henry, therefore, refused to comply with Gregory's decree. The stage was set for a monumental clash between two titans, each convinced of the righteousness of his cause. The conflict escalated rapidly. In 1076, Gregory excommunicated Henry IV, effectively releasing all his subjects from their oaths of loyalty. This was a devastating blow to Henry, as it emboldened his numerous enemies within the empire, particularly the rebellious Saxon princes who saw an opportunity to undermine imperial authority. Faced with widespread rebellion and the threat of being deposed, Henry was forced to make a humiliating pilgrimage across the Alps in the depths of winter to seek absolution from the Pope. This legendary journey culminated in January 1077 at the castle of Canossa in the Apennine Mountains. For 3 days, Henry, clad in penitential sackcloth, stood barefoot in the snow outside the castle gates, begging for the Pope's forgiveness. Gregory, initially reluctant, eventually relented, lifting the excommunication. Canossa was a profound, symbolic victory for the papacy, demonstrating the immense spiritual power the Pope wielded over even the most powerful secular ruler in Europe. It was a moment etched into the collective memory of the age, a stark reminder of the Church's growing influence. However, Canossa did not resolve the underlying issues. While Henry had secured his immediate political survival, the investiture controversy continued to rage. Henry, once back in Germany, quickly consolidated his power and resumed his struggle against the Pope. He appointed his own anti-pope, Clement III, and marched on Rome, eventually forcing Gregory VII into exile, where he died in 1085. The conflict continued through the reigns of Henry V and Paschal II, with both sides employing a mixture of diplomacy, excommunication, and military force. The long and bitter struggle finally found a fragile resolution in 1122 with the Concordat of Worms. This agreement, a compromise between Emperor Henry V and Pope Calixtus II, sought to disentangle the spiritual and temporal aspects of episcopal appointments. It stipulated that the emperor would give up the right to invest bishops and abbots with the ring and crozier, symbols of their spiritual authority. Instead, these would be bestowed by the Pope or his representatives. However, the emperor retained the right to be present at elections and to invest the chosen candidate with the scepter, symbolizing the temporal lands and secular responsibilities attached to the office. This meant that while the Church gained greater control over spiritual appointments, the emperor still held significant influence over who would hold these powerful positions within his realm. The Concordat of Worms was a landmark agreement, but it was not a definitive end to the tension between the papacy and the empire. It marked a shift in the balance of power, demonstrating the growing strength of the papacy and the limitations of imperial authority. While the emperors continued to wield immense power, they could no longer claim the same absolute control over the church within their borders that their Ottonian predecessors had enjoyed. This compromise also contributed to the gradual strengthening of the German princes, as the emperor's reliance on ecclesiastical officials as a counterweight to the secular nobility was somewhat diminished. This subtle shift would have profound long-term consequences for the internal structure of the empire, fostering a more decentralized political landscape. Beyond the investiture controversy, the empire faced other significant challenges that contributed to its evolving character. The eastward expansion, or Ostsiedlung, was a continuous process throughout the High Middle Ages. German settlers, often encouraged by emperors and local lords, moved into sparsely populated or Slavic-held lands east of the Elbe River, bringing with them new agricultural techniques, laws, and customs. This expansion was not always peaceful, often involving military conquest and displacement of indigenous populations. Yet it dramatically reshaped the demographics and cultural landscape of Central Europe, adding new territories and peoples to the imperial sphere of influence, even if these new lands often retained a distinct identity. One lesser-known detail from this period concerns the imperial regalia. While the crown, scepter, and orb are well-known symbols of imperial power, the Heilige Lanze, or Holy Lance, held a particularly mystical significance. Believed to be the lance that pierced Christ's side on the cross, it was considered a divine guarantee of victory in battle. Emperors often carried it into war, and its possession was seen as a sign of God's favor. The psychological impact of such a relic on both imperial armies and their adversaries cannot be overstated, transforming earthly conflict into a sacred struggle. The Salian dynasty, which succeeded the Ottonians, continued to grapple with the complexities of imperial rule. Conrad II, the first Salian emperor, reigned 1024 to 1039, was a skilled politician and military leader who consolidated imperial power and expanded its influence, particularly in Burgundy. His successor, Henry III, reigned 1039 to 1056, reached the zenith of Salian power. He was a devout and learned ruler who actively supported the Cluniac reforms and sought to elevate the moral standing of the Church. Ironically, his efforts to reform the papacy by appointing strong, reform-minded popes laid the groundwork for the very conflict that would engulf his son, Henry IV. The death of Henry III in 1056 left a young Henry IV to inherit a powerful but increasingly unstable empire. The long regency that followed, marked by squabbling among powerful nobles and churchmen, allowed centrifugal forces to gain strength. This period of imperial weakness provided fertile ground for the Gregorian reforms to take root and challenge the traditional imperial church system. Historians still debate the extent to which the personal failings or political miscalculations of Henry IV contributed to the intensity of the investiture controversy versus the inevitable clash of two powerful, evolving institutions, the papacy and the empire, each seeking to assert its ultimate authority in a rapidly changing world. Was Henry a victim of circumstance, or did his stubbornness exacerbate an already volatile situation? The answer likely lies in a complex interplay of both. The legacy of the investiture controversy was profound and far-reaching. It irrevocably altered the relationship between spiritual and temporal power in Europe. While the emperor retained significant influence, the papacy emerged from the struggle with enhanced prestige and a clearer definition of its spiritual authority. It also contributed to the fragmentation of political power within Germany. The long periods of conflict weakened the emperor's ability to control his vassals, leading to the rise of powerful territorial princes who consolidated their own domains and asserted greater independence from imperial authority. This decentralization would become a defining characteristic of the Holy Roman Empire for centuries to come, making it a unique political entity compared to the more centralized monarchies emerging in France and England. The struggle also had a lasting impact on legal and intellectual thought. The need to justify their respective positions led both imperial and papal factions to develop sophisticated legal arguments, drawing upon Roman law, canon law, and theological principles. This intellectual ferment contributed to the flourishing of legal studies in medieval universities, laying the groundwork for modern legal systems. The very idea of separate spheres of spiritual and temporal authority, though often contested, began to take shape, influencing political theory for generations. As the 12th century dawned, the Holy Roman Empire, though bruised by the Investiture controversy, remained a formidable power in Europe. However, its internal structure had been irrevocably altered, and the seeds of future conflicts, both with the papacy and with its own constituent princes, had been firmly sown. The dream of a unified Christian empire, so vivid in the minds of Otto I and Charlemagne before him, now faced the stark reality of competing powers and entrenched interests. The stage was set for the next chapter, one dominated by the dynamic and often, too, tumultuous reign of the Hohenstaufen emperors, who would attempt to reassert imperial authority with renewed vigor, leading to even more dramatic clashes with the papacy, and further shaping the destiny of this most complex of empires. The echoes of Canossa would continue to reverberate through the halls of power, a constant reminder of the delicate balance between crown and pros, and the enduring struggle for ultimate dominion. The Holy Roman Empire, a tapestry woven from threads of ambition and divine right, now found itself under the sway of a new, formidable dynasty, the Hohenstaufen. From their ancestral castle perched high in Swabia, these emperors dreamed of a universal dominion, a revival of Roman glory that would encompass not just the German lands and Italy, but perhaps even stretch beyond, asserting their authority over all of Christendom. This was a vision grander than Charlemagne's, more encompassing than Otto's, and it would bring them into direct, often violent confrontation with the other great power of the age, the papacy. Frederick I, known to history as Barbarossa, Redbeard, ascended to the imperial throne in 1152. He was a figure of legendary charisma, a knightly emperor who embodied the ideals of chivalry and justice. His reign marked a resurgence of imperial power, a golden age for the Hohenstaufen. Barbarossa saw himself as the true successor to the Caesars, divinely appointed to rule the world. He was a man of action, but also a shrewd politician, understanding the delicate balance of power within the empire. He sought to restore imperial authority over the powerful German princes, often through strategic alliances and the careful distribution of lands and titles. But his gaze, like many emperors before him, was firmly fixed on Italy. The wealthy city-states of Lombardy, burgeoning with trade and commerce, were a tempting prize. They enjoyed a degree of independence that Barbarossa found intolerable. He viewed them as rebellious subjects, withholding their rightful tribute and allegiance to the empire. His attempts to reassert imperial control led to a series of campaigns, 6 in total, that drained the imperial coffers and tested the loyalty of his German vassals. The Lombard League, a formidable alliance of these northern Italian cities, rose in defiance, supported and often instigated by the popes, who viewed a strong imperial presence in Italy as a direct threat to their own temporal power and spiritual independence. The Battle of Legnano in 1176 was a turning point. Here, Barbarossa's heavily armoured knights, the flower of German chivalry, faced the determined citizen militias of the Lombard League. The imperial forces, though initially successful, were ultimately routed. It was a stunning defeat for Barbarossa, forcing him to acknowledge the autonomy of the Italian cities and, more significantly, to make peace with Pope Alexander III. The Peace of Venice in 1177 was a humbling moment for the emperor, who, according to some accounts, prostrated himself before the pontiff. This act, whether literal or symbolic, underscored the enduring struggle between sacerdotium and imperium. The spiritual and temporal powers, a conflict that would define much of the Hohenstaufen era. Yet Barbarossa, ever the pragmatist, salvaged what he could. He secured the marriage of his son, Henry VI, to Constance, the heiress to the Norman kingdom of Sicily. This union, seemingly a stroke of genius, promised to unite the imperial crown with the rich and strategically vital lands of southern Italy and Sicily, encircling the Papal States and giving the Hohenstaufen an unparalleled position as power. It was a move that would have profound and lasting consequences, both for the empire and for the papacy. Barbarossa himself, after years of tireless campaigning and political maneuvering, met his end not on the battlefield, but in the waters of a river in Cilicia during the Third Crusade in 1190. His death, shrouded in some mystery, whether from drowning, a heart attack, or the chill of the water, sent shockwaves across Europe. He had been a unifying force, a symbol of imperial strength, and his sudden demise left a void that his successors would struggle to fill. His son, Henry VI, inherited the imperial mantle, and through his marriage to Constance, the Kingdom of Sicily. Henry was a man of immense ambition and considerable ability, but he was ruthless and cold, lacking his father's charismatic touch. He consolidated his power in Italy with an iron fist, brutally suppressing rebellions and asserting his authority over the Papal States. His vision was even grander than his father's: a hereditary empire, an end to the elective nature of the German crown, and a true universal monarchy. He even contemplated a crusade to conquer the Byzantine Empire, aiming to reunite the Eastern and Western Roman empires under his rule. But Henry's grand designs were cut short. He died suddenly in Messina in 1197, at the age of 32, likely from malaria, though rumours of poisoning persisted. His death plunged the empire into chaos. His only son, Frederick II, was a mere child of 3, and the succession was immediately disputed. The ensuing struggle, known as the German Civil War or the Staufen wealth struggle, saw rival claimants to the throne, Philip of Swabia, Henry's brother, and Otto IV, a Welf, tear the empire apart for over a decade. This period of intense internal conflict significantly weakened the central authority of the emperor, allowing the German princes to consolidate their own power and independence, a trend that would continue for centuries. It was into this turbulent world that Frederick II, the last great Hohenstaufen emperor, emerged. Raised in Sicily, a vibrant melting pot of cultures, Norman, Greek, Arab and Jewish. Frederick was a ruler unlike any before him. He was a polyglot, speaking several languages, the patron of arts and sciences, a skilled diplomat, and a brilliant military strategist. He was fascinated by falconry, mathematics, philosophy, and the natural world, earning him the moniker Stupa Mundi, wonder of the world. Yet he was also an enigma, a man of profound contradictions. A devout Christian who was accused of being a secret Muslim. A champion of justice who could be utterly ruthless. Frederick's reign, which began in earnest after the defeat of Otto IV at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, was a relentless struggle against the papacy. The popes, particularly Gregory IX and Innocent IV, saw Frederick's ambition and his control over both Germany and Sicily as an existential threat. They feared being encircled. Reduced to mere spiritual figureheads, their temporal power eclipsed. Frederick, for his part, viewed the papacy as an obstacle to his imperial vision, an illegitimate rival for universal authority. The conflict was bitter and protracted, marked by excommunications, crusades, and propaganda wars. Frederick, despite his deep interest in Islamic culture, was compelled to undertake a crusade to the Holy Land to appease the Pope. The Sixth Crusade, 1228 to 1229, was unique. Frederick, already excommunicated, negotiated the return of Jerusalem to Christian control through diplomacy with the Sultan al-Kamil, rather than through battle. This pragmatic approach, deeply unsettling to the papacy, only intensified their animosity. He was crowned King of Jerusalem in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, an act that further infuriated the Pope, who saw it as a sacrilege. Back in Italy, the struggle continued. Frederick sought to centralize power in his Kingdom of Sicily, creating a highly efficient bureaucratic state, a model for future European monarchies. He established the University of Naples, the first state-funded university, to train administrators for his burgeoning bureaucracy. He issued the Constitutions of Melfi in 1231, a comprehensive legal code that drew on Roman, Norman, and Arab legal traditions, establishing a uniform system of justice and administration throughout his southern Italian domains. This was a testament to his intellectual curiosity and his desire for efficient governance, a stark contrast to the more fragmented feudal systems prevalent elsewhere in Europe. However, his attempts to extend this centralized control to the Lombard cities and the German princes met with fierce resistance. The popes skillfully exploited these tensions, forming new Lombard leagues and rallying support against Frederick. They denounced him as an antichrist, a heretic, and a tyrant, launching a relentless campaign of spiritual warfare against him. Frederick, in turn, portrayed the popes as worldly, power-hungry prelates, betraying their spiritual mission. The struggle escalated into a full-blown war, with both sides employing mercenary armies and engaging in brutal sieges. Frederick's imperial forces, though formidable, were stretched thin across his vast domains. He faced constant rebellions in Germany, encouraged by the papacy, and a resurgent Lombard League in Italy. His final years were marked by weariness and betrayal. His beloved son, King Enzio of Sardinia, was captured by the Bolognese and imprisoned for life, a blow from which Frederick never fully recovered. Frederick II died in 1250 in Castel Fiorentino, Sicily, leaving behind an empire in turmoil and a legacy of both brilliance and controversy. His death marked the effective end of effective Hohenstaufen rule in the Holy Roman Empire. Though his son Conrad IV briefly held the imperial title, He too died young in 1254. The last true Hohenstaufen claimant, Conradin, Frederick's grandson, a mere boy, attempted to reclaim his inheritance in Italy, but was defeated and publicly executed in Naples in 1268 by Charles of Anjou, the new ruler of Sicily, who had been installed by the Pope. With Conradin's death, the direct male line of the Hohenstaufen emperors came to a tragic and definitive end. The period immediately following Frederick II's death, from 1250 to 1273, is known as the Interregnum. It was a time of profound political instability and decentralization within the Holy Roman Empire. With no strong emperor to assert central authority, the powerful German princes seized the opportunity to consolidate their own territorial power. They elected a series of weak or absentee emperors, often more interested in their own dynastic lands than in the welfare of the empire as a whole. This era saw the rise of numerous independent principalities, duchies, and free imperial cities, each vying for power and influence. The empire, once a grand vision of universal dominion, fractured into a patchwork of semi-autonomous states, a characteristic that would define Germany for centuries to come. The Hohenstaufen dream of a unified, centralized empire, stretching from the Baltic to Sicily, had crumbled. The relentless opposition of the papacy, coupled with the growing power and independence of the German princes, proved insurmountable. The popes, though they had ultimately triumphed over their imperial rivals, found their own authority diminished in the long run. The bitter conflicts had eroded faith in both institutions, paving the way for new political theories and the eventual rise of strong national monarchies elsewhere in Europe. Historians still debate the true legacy of the Hohenstaufen. Was Frederick II a visionary ahead of his time, a harbinger of modern statecraft, or a despotic ruler whose ambition ultimately destroyed the very empire he sought to strengthen? His intellectual curiosity, his embrace of diverse cultures, and his administrative innovations were remarkable for his era. Yet his relentless pursuit of universal dominion brought him into an irreconcilable conflict with the papacy, a conflict that ultimately weakened the imperial institution and led to the fragmentation of Germany. The Hohenstaufen era, for all its grandeur and tragedy, left an indelible mark on the Holy Roman Empire. It was a period of intense intellectual ferment, artistic flourishing, and profound political transformation. The castles they built, the laws they promulgated, and the cultural exchange they fostered all speak to a dynasty that, despite its ultimate failure to achieve universal dominion, left behind a rich and complex legacy. The empire that emerged from the Interregnum was vastly different from the one Barbarossa had envisioned. It was an empire where the balance of power had irrevocably shifted, where the princes held sway, and where the imperial title, though still revered, often represented more of a symbolic prestige than actual power. The stage was set for a new chapter, one where the Holy Roman Empire would navigate a fragmented landscape, forever shaped by the ambitions and struggles of its most magnificent and ultimately tragic dynasty. The flickering light of the Hohenstaufen star had finally guttered out, leaving a profound darkness across the Holy Roman Empire. The execution of Conradin in Naples in 1268, a chilling act that severed the last direct male link to Frederick II, plunged the realm into an era known as the Interregnum. It was a period not of peace, but of power vacuums and fragmented authority, where the very idea of a unified empire seemed to dissolve like mist in the morning sun. For nearly a quarter of a century, From 1254 to 1273, the imperial throne stood effectively empty, or at least occupied by figures whose claims were tenuous and whose influence rarely extended beyond their own immediate territories. Imagine the landscape of Central Europe during these years. Castles, once symbols of imperial might, now became independent strongholds, their lords vying for local dominance. The great princely families, the Wittelsbachs, the Wettins, the Ascanians, each saw an opportunity to expand their own power, to consolidate their lands, and to assert their independence from any overarching authority. The concept of a universal emperor, a divine arbiter of Christendom, began to fade from the everyday lives of peasants and townspeople, replaced by the more immediate reality of local dukes, counts, and bishops. This wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow, almost imperceptible erosion of central power, like a river gradually changing its course. During this time, several individuals were elected as King of the Romans, but none managed to secure widespread recognition or the crucial papal coronation that would legitimize their imperial title. Richard of Cornwall, brother of England's Henry III, was one such figure. He was elected in 1257 by some of the prince-electors, primarily due to his immense wealth, which he used to buy support. He made several journeys to Germany, attempting to establish his authority, but his efforts were largely in vain. His rival, Alfonso X of Castile, known as Alfonso the Wise, was elected by another faction of electors, also in 1257. Alfonso II spent vast sums and much effort trying to gain the imperial crown, but he never even set foot in Germany. These absentee or ineffective rulers only underscored the lack of a true central power, allowing the principalities to further entrench their autonomy. Historians still debate whether these elections were genuine attempts to restore order, or merely cynical maneuvers by the electors to extract wealth and concessions from ambitious foreign princes. Was it a sign of desperation for leadership, or a calculated exploitation of the imperial ideal for personal gain? The truth likely lies somewhere in between, a complex tapestry of ambition, tradition, and pragmatism. The cities, too, began to flourish in this vacuum. Without a strong emperor to assert his will, imperial cities and free cities gained greater self-governance, forming leagues like the Hanseatic League in the north to protect their trade interests and defend themselves against predatory nobles. These urban centers became hubs of commerce, culture, and innovation, their wealth and influence growing steadily, often at the expense of the traditional feudal aristocracy. The Rhine, the Danube, and the Elbe became arteries of trade, carrying not just goods but also ideas, fostering a nascent sense of regional identity that transcended the old imperial boundaries. Then, in 1273, a new chapter began, almost unexpectedly. The prince-electors, weary of the chaos, and perhaps fearing that the imperial office itself might become irrelevant, decided to choose a king from a less prominent, yet strategically important, noble house. Their choice fell upon Rudolf of Habsburg. The Habsburgs at this point were not among the most powerful German dynasties. Their ancestral lands were centered in what is now Switzerland and Alsace, a relatively modest territorial base. The electors, it is widely believed, chose Rudolf precisely because he was, as not too powerful. They hoped he would be a manageable figure, a king who would uphold the imperial dignity without threatening their own hard-won independence. But Rudolf was no mere figurehead. He was a shrewd and ambitious man, a seasoned warrior, and a skilled diplomat. His election marked the true beginning of the Habsburg dynasty's long and often dominant role in European history. He understood the precariousness of his position and the need to restore a semblance of order to the realm. One of his first and most significant acts was to confront Ottokar II of Bohemia, a powerful and expansionist king who had acquired vast territories, including Austria, Styria, and Carinthia, during the Interregnum. Ottokar, who had himself aspired to the imperial crown, refused to acknowledge Rudolf's authority and return the imperial fiefs he had seized. The ensuing conflict culminated in the Battle of Marchfeld in 1278. This was a pivotal moment. Rudolf, leading a coalition of German princes, faced Ottokar's formidable Bohemian and Moravian forces. The battle was fierce, and Ottokar himself was killed, marking a decisive victory for Rudolf. This triumph allowed Rudolf to reclaim Austria, Styria, and Carinthia as lapsed imperial fiefs. Crucially, instead of returning them to the imperial domain or distributing them among other princes, Rudolf invested his own sons, Albert and Rudolf, with these territories in 1282. This act, though seemingly straightforward, was a stroke of dynastic genius. It transformed the Habsburgs from a relatively minor Swabian noble family into one of the most powerful land-holding dynasties in the empire, laying the foundation for their future territorial expansion and their eventual, almost hereditary claim to the imperial crown. The acquisition of Austria was a game-changer. The Habsburgs now possessed a compact, strategically located block of territories along the Danube, rich in resources and offering access to important trade routes. This shift in their power base meant that their focus gradually began to move away from their original Swabian homelands and towards their new Austrian heartland. This was a profound and lasting consequence of Rudolf's reign. The imperial office, while still important, became increasingly intertwined with the dynastic interests of the Habsburgs. The emperor was no longer just the head of a universal empire. He was also, and perhaps primarily, the head of a powerful territorial state. Rudolf's reign, though relatively short, brought a much-needed period of stability after the Interregnum. He worked to restore imperial authority, enforce peace, and reclaim alienated imperial lands. He understood that the empire, in its traditional sense, was fractured, and that a new model was emerging, one where the strength of the emperor derived as much from his own dynastic power as from the theoretical universality of his office. He never achieved a papal coronation as emperor, remaining king of the Romans, but his actions undeniably set the stage for the Habsburgs' future dominance. Following Rudolf's death in 1291, the electors once again sought to prevent the rise of a powerful dynastic line. They passed over Rudolf's son, Albert, and instead elected Adolf of Nassau. This repeated pattern of electing weaker candidates, or those from less powerful houses after a strong ruler, highlights the electors' persistent fear of a centralized imperial power that could diminish their own autonomy. Adolf, however, proved to be more ambitious than anticipated, leading to conflict with the powerful princes, including Rudolf's son, Albert. This culminated in the Battle of Golheim in 1298, where Adolf was defeated and killed by Albert. This paved the way for Albert I of Habsburg to finally ascend to the throne, further solidifying the Habsburg presence in the imperial line. The early 14th century saw a complex interplay of dynastic ambitions and imperial elections. While the Habsburgs had established a strong territorial base in Austria, they were not yet the undisputed masters of the imperial throne. Other powerful families, notably the House of Luxembourg, emerged as significant rivals. Henry VII of Luxembourg, elected king in 1308, briefly revived the imperial ideal with his journey to Italy for a papal coronation, becoming the first emperor since Frederick II. His reign, though cut short by his death in 1313, offered a fleeting glimpse of a revitalized empire, one that still looked to Italy and the universal claims of Rome. His vision, however, was an exception rather than the rule. The struggle for the imperial crown continued with Louis IV of Bavaria, Wittelsbach, and Frederick the Fair of Austria, Habsburg, vying for power, leading to years of civil war. Louis eventually emerged victorious, but his reign was marked by ongoing conflict with the papacy, which had by now relocated to Avignon. This period saw the formalization of the electoral process with the Golden Bull of 1356, issued by Emperor Charles IV of Luxembourg. This landmark document, perhaps the most important constitutional text of the Holy Roman Empire, definitively established the 7 prince-electors, 3 ecclesiastical, the archbishops of Mainz, Trier and Cologne, and 4 secular, the King of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg. It outlined their rights and privileges, ensuring that the imperial election would remain in their hands and effectively preventing the rise of a hereditary monarchy. The Golden Bull, in essence, codified the decentralized nature of the empire, acknowledging the reality that had emerged from the Interregnum, a collection of powerful territorial states under a loosely defined imperial head. This formalization of the electoral system, while bringing a degree of order, also cemented the power of the individual princes. The emperor, though theoretically supreme, was often dependent on the support and cooperation of these powerful electors. His power was not absolute, but negotiated, a delicate balance between imperial authority and princely autonomy. The empire, therefore, continued to evolve, not towards a unified nation-state like France or England, but as a unique political entity, a patchwork of diverse territories held together by a shared history, a common legal framework, and the symbolic power of the imperial crown. The Habsburgs, however, with their growing territorial base and their strategic marriages, were slowly but surely consolidating their influence. While they lost the imperial crown for a period after Albert I, they continued to build their dynastic power. The acquisition of Austria, Styria, and Carinthia had been just the beginning. Through a series of astute political moves, inheritances, and further strategic marriages, they gradually expanded their domains. They understood that in the fragmented landscape of the empire, true power lay not just in the imperial title, but in the extent and wealth of one's own dynastic lands. The focus had indeed shifted. The emperor was no longer just the protector of Christendom. He was increasingly the patriarch of a sprawling family enterprise, a dynastic power whose interests often superseded, or at least heavily influenced, the broader interests of the empire. The late 14th and early 15th centuries saw the imperial crown oscillate between various houses, including the Wittelsbachs and the Luxembourgs. However, a crucial turning point arrived in 1438, with the election of Albert II of Habsburg. From this point forward, with only one brief exception in the 18th century, the imperial crown would remain continuously in the hands of the Habsburg dynasty until the empire's dissolution in 1806. This remarkable continuity was not due to a sudden shift in the Golden Bull, which still mandated elections, but rather to the Habsburgs' increasing dynastic power, their ability to secure the support of the electors, and, perhaps most importantly, their growing reputation as the most suitable candidates to defend the empire against external threats, particularly the rising power of the Ottoman Empire in the east. The Habsburgs had mastered the art of dynastic politics. Their motto, Bella gerant alii, tu felix Austria nube, let others wage war, but you, happy Austria, marry, perfectly encapsulated their strategy. Through a series of brilliant and often complex marriage alliances, they acquired vast territories, including Burgundy, Spain, and eventually Bohemia and Hungary. These acquisitions, while not directly part of the Holy Roman Empire in the same way as the German principalities, brought immense wealth, prestige, and military resources to the Habsburg house, further cementing their position as the preeminent power in Europe. This slow, deliberate accumulation of power, often through peaceful means, stands in stark contrast to the often violent territorial disputes of earlier centuries. By the mid-15th century, the Holy Roman Empire, while still a collection of largely independent states, was undeniably dominated by the Habsburgs. The imperial office, once a universal ideal, had become a powerful tool for advancing Habsburg dynastic interests. The emperor was still the theoretical head of Christendom, the protector of the church, and the arbiter of disputes within the empire. But in practice, his actions were increasingly guided by the needs of his own vast territorial possessions, stretching from the Low Countries to the Iberian Peninsula, and from Austria to the distant Americas. The empire had weathered the storm of the Interregnum, but it had emerged profoundly changed, its destiny now inextricably linked with the fortunes of one of Europe's most enduring and influential dynasties. The echoes of Rudolf of Habsburg's shrewd move in 1282, investing his sons with Austria, reverberated for centuries, shaping the political landscape of an entire continent. The gentle hum of monastic chants, a sound that had echoed through Europe's valleys and across its sun-drenched plains for centuries, was about to be fractured by a new discordant chorus. The Holy Roman Empire, a sprawling tapestry woven with threads of ancient tradition and burgeoning modernity, stood on the precipice of a seismic shift. For generations, the spiritual authority of Rome had been largely unquestioned, a bedrock upon which much of Western European society was built. But beneath this veneer of unity, currents of discontent had long been stirring. Calls for reform, for a return to what many perceived as the purer, simpler faith of early Christianity, had grown steadily louder. The perceived opulence of the church, the sale of indulgences promising salvation, and the vast political power wielded by the papacy had all become points of friction, particularly in the German lands of the empire, where resentment against perceived Roman exploitation simmered. Then, in 1517, a single act, seemingly small in its immediate context, ignited a conflagration that would reshape not only the empire, but the entire continent. A quiet Augustinian friar and professor of theology named Martin Luther, troubled by what he saw as profound abuses within the church, nailed his 95 theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. This wasn't an act of outright rebellion at first. It was an academic challenge, a call for scholarly debate on the practice of selling indulgences. Yet, the printing press, a revolutionary technology still in its relative infancy, seized upon Luther's words and amplified them beyond anything he could have imagined. Within weeks, copies of his theses, translated from Latin into German, were circulating widely, sparking a fervent discussion among scholars, princes, and common folk alike. The very air seemed to crackle with anticipation, a sense that something monumental was unfolding. Luther's theological propositions, particularly his emphasis on sola fide, salvation through faith alone, not through good works or papal decrees, directly challenged the Church's established doctrines and its hierarchical structure. He advocated for the direct reading of Scripture by all believers, translating the Bible into vernacular German, an act that democratized access to religious texts and further empowered individual interpretation. This wasn't merely a theological dispute, it was a profound challenge to authority itself. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, a devout Catholic who ruled an empire on which the sun never set, found himself caught in an impossible bind. On one hand, he was the traditional protector of the Church. On the other, many of his princes, driven by genuine religious conviction, political ambition, or both, began to embrace Luther's ideas. The Diet of Worms in 1521 stands as a pivotal moment. Luther, summoned before the emperor and the assembled princes of the empire, refused to recant his writings unless convinced by scripture or plain reason. His defiant stand, famously encapsulated in the words, "Here I stand, I can do no other," solidified his position as a leader of a burgeoning movement. Charles V, bound by his imperial oath and his personal faith, declared Luther an outlaw. But the Elector of Saxony, Frederick the Wise, spirited him away to Wartburg Castle, where Luther continued his work, translating the New Testament and refining his theological arguments. This act of protection by a powerful prince underscored the growing schism within the empire. The religious question was fast becoming a political one, intertwined with the long-standing desire of many German princes for greater autonomy from imperial and papal authority. The spread of Lutheranism was astonishingly rapid, particularly in the northern German states. Princes saw an opportunity to seize church lands and wealth, to assert greater control over their territories, and to resist the centralizing tendencies of the Habsburg Emperor. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555, a landmark agreement, attempted to resolve the religious strife, at least temporarily. It established the principle of cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm, his religion, meaning that each prince could determine the official religion of his own territory. While this brought a fragile peace, it also codified the religious division of the empire, creating a patchwork of Catholic and Protestant states. Imagine the landscape then. One valley might echo with the Latin Mass, while just over the hill, a different village would be singing hymns in German, their churches stripped of their elaborate altars and icons. This peace, however, was more of a truce than a true resolution, leaving underlying tensions simmering beneath the surface. The impact of the Reformation extended far beyond theology and princely politics. It spurred intellectual ferment, leading to new forms of education and literacy. It also fueled social unrest. The Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525, a brutal uprising driven by social grievances and interpreted through the lens of Luther's calls for Christian freedom, shook the empire to its core. Although Luther himself condemned the violence, the rebellion demonstrated the explosive potential of religious ideas when combined with deep-seated social inequality. The suppression of the revolt, with immense loss of life, served as a stark reminder of the volatile nature of the era. As the 16th century drew to a close, the religious landscape of the empire became even more complex with the rise of Calvinism, a more radical form of Protestantism originating in Switzerland. Unlike Lutheranism, which retained some elements of traditional Catholic liturgy, Calvinism emphasized predestination and a stricter, more austere form of worship. It spread particularly in the Palatinate and parts of Bohemia, further destabilized the delicate balance established by the Peace of Augsburg, as Calvinism was not explicitly recognized by the agreement. This omission would prove to be a fatal flaw. The early 17th century saw the empire teetering on the brink. The religious divisions had hardened into political factions, with the Catholic League and the Protestant Union facing off, armed and ready. The Bohemian Revolt in 1618, sparked by the Habsburg Emperor Ferdinand II's attempts to suppress Protestantism in Bohemia, ignited what would become the 30 Years' War. This conflict, perhaps the most devastating in European history before the 20th century, was not solely about religion. It quickly evolved into a complex struggle for power, involving most of the major European powers, including France, Sweden, and Spain, all with their own geopolitical interests. The war was a kaleidoscope of shifting alliances, brutal sieges, and widespread destruction. Armies, often composed of mercenaries, ravaged the land, leaving famine and disease in their wake. The Holy Roman Empire became the primary battleground, its towns and villages plundered, its population decimated. Historians still debate the exact figures, but estimates suggest that some regions lost as much as 50% of their population. A truly staggering toll. Imagine the silence that would fall over once bustling market squares, the empty fields where crops once grew, the forgotten paths leading to villages that simply ceased to exist. The sheer scale of suffering is almost incomprehensible. One particularly grim aspect of the war was the sack of Magdeburg in 1631. Imperial forces under Count Tilly besieged the Protestant city. After its fall, a horrific massacre and widespread arson ensued, destroying much of the city and killing an estimated 20,000 to 25,000 of its inhabitants. This event became a symbol of the war's brutality and was widely reported across Europe, further hardening resolve on all sides. It was a stark reminder of how religious fervor, when intertwined with political ambition and military might, could unleash unimaginable horrors. The intervention of foreign powers further complicated the conflict. Sweden, under its brilliant military king Gustavus Adolphus, entered the war in 1630, providing crucial support to the Protestant cause. France, a Catholic nation, surprisingly allied with the Protestant powers against the Habsburgs, demonstrating that dynastic and geopolitical interests often trumped religious solidarity. This shift transformed the conflict from a purely internal German struggle into a pan-European power struggle, further prolonging the agony. The war dragged on for 3 decades, a grinding, attritional conflict that seemed to have no end. The initial religious zeal gradually faded, replaced by a weary pragmatism. The original issues of faith became blurred by the sheer weight of destruction and the desperate struggle for survival. By the 1640s, all sides were exhausted, their resources depleted, their populations ravaged. The desire for peace became overwhelming. The Peace of Westphalia, signed in 1648, finally brought an end to the long nightmare. It was a monumental diplomatic achievement, a series of treaties that fundamentally reshaped the European political order. For the Holy Roman Empire, its impact was profound and in many ways terminal. The treaties reaffirmed the principle of cuius regio, eius religio. Eius religio, but crucially, they extended recognition to Calvinism alongside Catholicism and Lutheranism, acknowledging the new religious realities. More significantly, the Peace of Westphalia granted the individual states of the empire unprecedented sovereignty. They gained the right to conduct their own foreign policy, form alliances, and wage war, albeit with some limitations. This effectively formalized the decentralization of the empire, transforming it from a cohesive, if loosely bound entity into a collection of largely independent states. The emperor's power, already diminished by the Reformation, was now further curtailed. He remained a symbolic head, a figure of prestige, but his ability to impose his will on the constituent states was severely weakened. The Imperial Diet, the Reichstag, became the primary forum for resolving disputes, but its decisions often required the consent of numerous princes, making effective governance incredibly difficult. The Holy Roman Empire, though it would nominally endure for another century and a half, was now a shadow of its former self, a complex legal framework rather than a unified political power. Its vastness, once its strength, now contributed to its fragmentation. The legacy of the Reformation and the 30 Years' War was etched deeply into the German lands. The religious divisions became permanent, shaping cultural identities and political alignments for centuries. The devastation left an indelible mark on the landscape and the collective memory, fostering a deep-seated aversion to large-scale conflict. Yet from the ashes of war, new ideas about state sovereignty, international law, and religious toleration began to emerge, laying some of the groundwork for the modern European state system. The dream of a unified Christian empire, so central to the Holy Roman Empire's identity, had been shattered, replaced by a mosaic of sovereign states, each charting its own course. The gentle hum of unity had been replaced by a polyphony of voices, each asserting its own truth, its own power, in a Europe forever changed. The Holy Roman Empire, a tapestry woven from centuries of ambition and faith, now stood on the precipice of its most devastating trial. The seeds of discord, sown by the Reformation and nurtured by political rivalries, were about to blossom into a cataclysm that would reshape the very foundations of Europe, the 30 Years' War. It began, as so many grand tragedies do, with a seemingly minor incident. In 1618, a delegation of Protestant Bohemian nobles, incensed by the Catholic Habsburg Emperor Ferdinand II's revocation of religious freedoms, stormed Prague Castle. They seized 2 imperial regents and their secretary, and, in a defiant act that reverberated across the continent, threw them out of a high window. Miraculously, the men survived, landing in a pile of manure. But the message was clear. Bohemia would not tolerate religious oppression. This defenestration of Prague, as it became known, ignited a powder keg. Initially, It was a local Bohemian revolt, a struggle for religious and political autonomy against Habsburg dominance. But the flames quickly spread, fanned by the intricate web of alliances and antagonisms that characterized the empire. Protestant princes, fearing for their own religious liberties, sided with the Bohemians. Catholic powers, eager to uphold imperial authority and suppress heresy, rallied behind Ferdinand. The conflict escalated, drawing in neighboring states, each with their own agendas. Denmark, under King Christian IV, intervened in 1625, motivated by a desire to protect Protestantism and expand Danish influence in northern Germany. Sweden, under the brilliant military leadership of King Gustavus Adolphus, entered the fray in 1630, transforming the war with his innovative tactics and highly disciplined army. Even Catholic France, under the cunning Cardinal Richelieu, eventually joined the Protestant side, not out of religious conviction, but out of a pragmatic desire to weaken the Habsburgs, who encircled France with their vast territories. The war became a brutal, protracted affair, characterized by shifting alliances, devastating sieges, and widespread destruction. Armies, often composed of mercenaries, marched across the German lands, living off the land and leaving a trail of desolation in their wake. Villages were plundered, towns burned, and populations decimated by famine and disease, which often proved more lethal than the battles themselves. The sheer scale of the suffering is almost unimaginable. Historians estimate that the population of the German states, the heartland of the empire, may have fallen by as much as 25% to 40% in some areas, and in some regions, like Württemberg, the decline was as high as 75%. Imagine entire communities vanishing, their fields lying fallow, their churches silent. This was not just a war of armies, but a war against the very fabric of society. One of the most enduring mysteries of the war revolves around the enigmatic figure of Albrecht von Wallenstein, a Bohemian nobleman and brilliant military commander who served the emperor. Wallenstein amassed a vast private army, funded by contributions from conquered territories, and achieved remarkable victories for the Habsburg cause. Yet, his ambition and independence grew to such an extent that he became a source of deep suspicion for Ferdinand II. Was Wallenstein genuinely loyal to the emperor, or did he harbour secret ambitions to carve out his own kingdom, perhaps even to seize the imperial crown? Historians still debate the true nature of his intentions. His eventual assassination in 1634, ordered by the emperor himself, remains a murky episode, shrouded in intrigue and betrayal. Was it a necessary act to preserve imperial authority, or a tragic misjudgment born of paranoia? The truth, like so much from that tumultuous era, remains elusive, a whisper carried on the winds of history. The war dragged on for 3 decades, a seemingly endless cycle of violence and despair. The initial religious fervour gradually gave way to a more cynical struggle for power and territory. The Holy Roman Empire, once a symbol of unity, became a battleground where competing European powers vied for dominance. The impact on the imperial institutions was profound. The emperor's authority, already weakened by the Reformation, was further eroded as princes asserted their sovereignty and formed their own alliances, often against the emperor himself. The Reichstag, the imperial diet, became increasingly ineffective, unable to stem the tide of destruction or enforce peace. Amidst the carnage, a slow, arduous path towards peace began to emerge. Exhaustion, more than anything else, drove the warring parties to the negotiating table. The sheer cost in lives and resources was unsustainable. Beginning in 1643, delegates from across Europe gathered in the Westphalian cities of Münster and Osnabrück. These negotiations were unprecedented in their scope and complexity, involving hundreds of diplomats representing nearly every major European power. Imagine the scene: bustling streets filled with carriages and liveried servants, grand halls where dignitaries in elaborate attire debated and haggled for years. The sheer logistics of housing and feeding so many delegates, and maintaining communication across war-torn lands, was a monumental undertaking. Finally, in October 1648, after 5 years of painstaking diplomacy, the Treaties of Westphalia were signed. These treaties did not just end a war, they fundamentally reshaped the legal and political landscape of Europe, and particularly the Holy Roman Empire. The most significant outcome was the establishment of the principle of cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm, his religion, which had been tentatively introduced in the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, but now included Calvinism alongside Catholicism and Lutheranism. This meant that the ruler of each state could determine its official religion, and subjects who did not conform were generally granted the right to emigrate. This effectively ended the era of religious wars in Europe, at least in their grand continent-spanning form. The pursuit of a unified Christian empire under a single faith was finally abandoned. Beyond religious settlement, the Treaties of Westphalia had profound implications for the political structure of the Holy Roman Empire. The individual states within the empire, numbering in the hundreds, gained significant autonomy. They were granted the right to conduct their own foreign policy, form alliances, and wage war, provided these actions were not directed against the emperor or the empire. This effectively acknowledged and formalized the fragmentation of imperial power. The emperor's authority, though not entirely extinguished, was drastically curtailed. The empire became, in essence, a loose confederation of sovereign states, rather than a centralized monarchy. This marked a crucial step in the development of the modern concept of state sovereignty, where each state exercises exclusive authority over its territory and people, free from external interference. One of the lesser-known but historically significant details of the Westphalian negotiations was the inclusion of provisions for the restoration of property and rights that had been seized during the war, particularly those belonging to religious institutions. This was an incredibly complex undertaking, requiring meticulous record-keeping and often leading to further disputes. Imagine trying to unravel decades of confiscations, occupations, and sales of land and assets across a devastated continent. The sheer administrative effort involved in attempting to restore order and justice after such chaos speaks to the desire, however imperfectly realized, to rebuild a semblance of stability. The Treaties of Westphalia also had a lasting impact on the balance of power in Europe. France emerged as the dominant continental power, having successfully weakened its Habsburg rivals. Sweden gained new territories in northern Germany, solidifying its position as a major player. The Dutch Republic and the Swiss Confederation were formally recognized as independent states, free from imperial jurisdiction. The Holy Roman Empire, though it continued to exist for another century and a half, was profoundly transformed. It was no longer the universal empire envisioned by Charlemagne or Otto the Great, but a collection of diverse entities bound by a common, albeit weakened, imperial framework. The legacy of Westphalia is complex and multifaceted. On the one hand, it brought an end to an era of horrific religious conflict and laid the groundwork for a more secular international order. It introduced the concept of a balance of power, where states would seek to prevent any single power from dominating the continent. On the other hand, it cemented the political fragmentation of Germany, a condition that would persist for centuries and have profound consequences for its future development. The dream of a unified German nation, once embodied by the empire, would have to wait for a very different age. As the dust settled across the ravaged lands of the empire, a new era dawned. The old certainties had been shattered, the old aspirations for universal empire largely abandoned. The Holy Roman Empire, though still bearing its ancient name, was a different entity. Scarred by war, redefined by peace, its resilience had been tested to its limits, and while it survived, it did so as a testament to the enduring power of political compromise and the devastating cost of intractable conflict. The memory of those 30 years of suffering would linger, a somber lesson etched into the collective consciousness of a continent. The whispers of the wind through the ruins of countless villages, the silent testimony of overgrown battlefields, all spoke of a time when faith and power had clashed with such ferocity that the very heart of Europe nearly stopped beating. Yet, from that crucible of destruction, new ideas of statehood, sovereignty, and international relations began to emerge, slowly, painfully, pointing towards a future that would be shaped by the lessons learned in the shadow of Westphalia. The dust of the 30 Years' War, though settled, still clung to the fabric of the Holy Roman Empire, leaving a landscape irrevocably altered. While the Peace of Westphalia had ostensibly restored a measure of order, it had also redefined the very nature of imperial power. The emperor, once a figure of undeniable authority, now found his influence diluted, his grand ambitions constrained by the newly solidified sovereignty of the individual states. Yet, amidst this fragmentation, a new dynamic began to emerge, one that would shape the empire's final centuries: the ascendance of two formidable powers, the House of Habsburg and the burgeoning state of Brandenburg Prussia. For the Habsburgs, the Peace of Westphalia, while a blow to their universalist aspirations, also presented an opportunity. With their grip on the empire loosened, they turned their attention inward, consolidating their hereditary lands into a more cohesive and powerful entity. The vast and disparate territories, Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, and various smaller domains, had long been a patchwork, united primarily by the crown they shared. Now, under emperors like Leopold I, who reigned for a remarkable 48 years from 1658 to 1705, a concerted effort was made to centralize administration, standardize laws, and foster a shared sense of identity among their diverse peoples. This was no easy task, given the deep-seated regional loyalties and the linguistic and cultural divides. But the Habsburgs, with their deep reservoirs of wealth and their long-standing prestige, were uniquely positioned to undertake it. Leopold I, a man of profound piety and intellectual curiosity, understood that the future of his dynasty lay not in a revived universal empire, but in a strong, unified territorial state. He invested heavily in his military, recognizing that power in the post-Westphalian world was increasingly measured by the strength of one's armies. The Ottoman Empire, a persistent threat on the eastern borders, provided a constant impetus for military innovation and expansion. The Great Turkish War, which raged intermittently from 1683 to 1699, saw the Habsburgs, often in alliance with other European powers, push back the Ottoman tide, culminating in the decisive victory at the Battle of Zenta in 1697. This triumph, spearheaded by the brilliant Eugene of Savoy, not only secured Hungary for the Habsburgs, but also cemented their reputation as a bulwark against perceived Eastern aggression. These victories brought vast new territories and resources into the Habsburg fold, further solidifying their power base. Simultaneously, the Habsburg court in Vienna blossomed into a centre of art, music, and Baroque splendour. Grand palaces like Schönbrunn began to take shape, reflecting the dynasty's renewed confidence and wealth. This cultural flourishing served not only as a display of power, but also as a means of projecting a unified identity, drawing diverse nobility and artists from across their lands into the imperial orbit. The Habsburgs, while still emperors of the Holy Roman Empire, were increasingly becoming the rulers of a powerful, centralized Austrian monarchy, a distinct entity with its own interests and ambitions. Yet as the Habsburg star ascended in the south and east, a new and unexpected rival was quietly but determinedly rising in the north: Brandenburg, Prussia. For centuries, Brandenburg had been a relatively minor principality within the empire, its sandy plains and scattered territories offering little in the way of natural resources or strategic advantage. Its rulers, the Hohenzollerns, were a diligent but largely unheralded dynasty. The Elector Frederick William, known to history as the Great Elector, who reigned from 1640 to 1688, was the architect of this remarkable transformation. He inherited a land devastated by the 30 Years' War, its population decimated, its economy in ruins. But Frederick William possessed an iron will and a clear vision. He understood that in a fragmented empire, survival and prosperity depended on a strong military and an efficient administration. He embarked on an ambitious program of state building, centralizing authority, reforming the tax system, and, crucially, building a standing army. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who relied on mercenaries or feudal levies, Frederick William created a professional, disciplined force, loyal directly to him. He attracted skilled administrators and officers from across Europe, fostering a culture of meritocracy that was unusual for its time. His pragmatic approach extended to religious policy. He welcomed Protestant refugees, particularly the Huguenots fleeing persecution in France, who brought with them valuable skills and capital, enriching his lands and bolstering his population. This influx of skilled labour and intellectual capital was a lesser-known but vital factor in Prussia's rapid development. By the end of his reign, Frederick William had transformed Brandenburg from a minor player into a formidable regional power. His son, Frederick I, capitalized on this foundation. In 1701, with the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I's consent, a concession granted in exchange for Prussian military support in the War of the Spanish Succession, Frederick elevated his Duchy of Prussia to a kingdom, styling himself King in Prussia. This was a bold and symbolic move, for it formally recognized the Hohenzollerns as sovereign rulers, no longer merely electors within the empire. It marked a significant shift in the balance of power, creating a new independent pole of authority in the north. The rise of Prussia under Frederick William and Frederick I was not without its challenges. The scattered nature of their territories, particularly the separation of Brandenburg from the Duchy of Prussia, posed logistical and administrative hurdles. Historians still debate the extent to which the Hohenzollerns deliberately aimed for imperial dominance from the outset, or if their expansion was a more opportunistic response to the prevailing political climate. Some argue that their initial ambitions were more modest, focused on securing their borders and consolidating their existing lands, while others see a clear, long-term strategy to challenge Habsburg hegemony. Regardless of their initial intent, the trajectory of Prussian power was undeniable. The stage was now set for a long and often bitter rivalry between these two emerging giants within the Holy Roman Empire. The Habsburgs, with their vast territories, ancient lineage, and imperial crown, represented the established order, albeit a reformed one. Prussia, with its lean, efficient military and its dynamic, centralized administration, embodied a new kind of state, one built on a foundation of discipline and pragmatic ambition. The early 18th century saw this rivalry simmer, occasionally flaring into open conflict. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, while primarily a struggle for the Spanish throne between the Habsburgs and the Bourbons of France, also drew in other European powers, including Prussia. The Hohenzollerns, initially allied with the Habsburgs, used the conflict to further their own interests, gaining territory and consolidating their international standing. This period also saw the development of the Prussian militarism that would become a defining characteristic of the state. Under Frederick William I, known as the Soldier King, reigned 1713 to 1740. The Prussian army was transformed into arguably the most efficient fighting force in Europe, a machine of unparalleled discipline and precision. He famously spent a disproportionate amount of the state budget on his military, often at the expense of other public services, but his efforts created a formidable instrument of power. He also established a highly centralized bureaucracy, ensuring that every aspect of the state served the military's needs. The contrast between the two powers was striking. The Habsburg Empire, a sprawling multi-ethnic entity, was often hampered by its internal diversity and the need to balance the interests of its many constituent parts. Its military, while powerful, sometimes struggled with logistical challenges across its vast domains. The Prussian state, by contrast, was smaller, more ethnically homogeneous, though still containing significant Polish and Sorbian minorities, and ruthlessly efficient. Its army was its pride and joy. A symbol of its identity, the true clash between these two titans came with the ascension of Frederick II, later known as Frederick the Great, to the Prussian throne in 1740, the very year that Maria Theresa inherited the Habsburg lands. The death of Emperor Charles VI without a male heir triggered a succession crisis, as many European powers questioned Maria Theresa's right to inherit, despite the pragmatic sanction designed to secure her succession. Frederick, seeing an opportunity to expand Prussia's power and territory, immediately invaded Silesia, a wealthy Habsburg province. This audacious act ignited the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748, a conflict that drew in most of Europe and fundamentally reshaped the balance of power within the Holy Roman Empire. Maria Theresa, a young and determined ruler, fought fiercely to defend her inheritance. She rallied her diverse subjects, proving to be a capable and inspiring leader. Despite losing Silesia to Prussia in the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, she managed to secure her throne and preserve the bulk of her hereditary lands. The war, however, irrevocably altered the relationship between Austria and Prussia. What had been a simmering rivalry now became an open and often brutal competition for supremacy within the German-speaking world. The loss of Silesia was a bitter pill for the Habsburgs, a wealthy and strategically important province. It also exposed the vulnerabilities of their vast, decentralized empire. Maria Theresa, learning from this experience, embarked on a series of far-reaching reforms, strengthening her military, centralizing administration, and promoting economic development. She understood that to compete with the lean efficiency of Prussia, the Habsburg monarchy needed to modernize and streamline its own structures. She established military academies, reformed the tax system, and even introduced compulsory education in some areas, a progressive step for its time. The rivalry intensified further in the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, a truly global conflict that saw Austria, allied with France and Russia, attempt to reclaim Silesia from Prussia. Frederick the Great, despite being vastly outnumbered for much of the war, demonstrated extraordinary military genius, often snatching victory from the jaws of defeat. His campaigns, though costly in terms of human life, further cemented Prussia's reputation as a military powerhouse and Frederick's as one of history's greatest commanders. The war ended with Silesia remaining in Prussian hands, a definitive victory for the Hohenzollerns, and a clear indication that Prussia was now a major European power, capable of challenging the Habsburgs directly. The existence of two such powerful and competing states within the Holy Roman Empire created an inherent tension that would ultimately contribute to its demise. The empire, designed to be a loose confederation under the nominal leadership of the emperor, could not long sustain two dominant powers vying for influence and territory. The focus of German politics shifted from the imperial diet and the emperor's court to the capitals of Vienna and Berlin. The smaller states of the empire often found themselves caught in the middle, forced to choose sides or navigate a precarious path between these two giants. The nature of this rivalry was also profoundly different. The Habsburgs, though embracing reform, still represented a more traditional, dynastic form of rule, deeply intertwined with the Catholic Church and a sense of historical legitimacy. Prussia, by contrast, embodied a more modern, secular, and meritocratic approach to statecraft, prioritizing military strength and bureaucratic efficiency above all else. This ideological divergence further fueled their competition. The 18th century, therefore, witnessed a profound transformation within the Holy Roman Empire. The Habsburgs, while losing some of their imperial luster, successfully transformed their hereditary lands into a formidable multinational monarchy. Simultaneously, Brandenburg Prussia, through sheer will and military prowess, rose from obscurity to become a major European power, directly challenging Habsburg hegemony. This dual development created a dynamic tension that would define the empire's final decades, pulling it in two different directions and ultimately contributing to its inability to adapt to the revolutionary changes sweeping across Europe at the turn of the 19th century. The ancient tapestry of the Holy Roman Empire, once woven with countless threads of independent states under a single, is often symbolic emperor, was now dominated by two bold, distinct patterns, each vying for the most prominent position. As the 17th century waned and the 18th dawned, a new intellectual light began to spread across Europe, subtly but profoundly shifting the foundations upon which the Holy Roman Empire had so long rested. This was the Age of Enlightenment, a period when reason, individualism, and skepticism challenged traditional authority and dogma. Philosophers like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Voltaire, though often writing from outside the empire's direct political sphere, saw their ideas permeate its many borders, carried by books, pamphlets, and lively intellectual salons. The divine right of kings, a concept that had buttressed imperial power for centuries, began to crumble under the weight of arguments for popular sovereignty and natural rights. Within the empire's diverse territories, these ideas found fertile ground. In the Habsburg lands, particularly under Emperor Joseph II, a fascinating, if sometimes contradictory, embrace of enlightened absolutism took hold. Joseph, a fervent believer in rational reform, sought to modernize his sprawling domains, often clashing with the entrenched privileges of the nobility and the church. He abolished serfdom, promoted religious tolerance through the Edict of Tolerance in 1781, and reformed the legal system, all in an attempt to create a more efficient, equitable state. Yet his reforms were often imposed from above, with little regard for local customs or consent, leading to widespread resistance and resentment. He was, in a way, attempting to build a modern state within the ancient, fragmented shell of the Holy Roman Empire, a task that proved ultimately impossible. His ambitious, rapid changes, though well-intentioned, often destabilized more than they reformed, showing the deep-seated resistance to top-down change in a realm so accustomed to its myriad local autonomies. Meanwhile, in the smaller German states, intellectuals and artists grappled with these new currents in their own ways. The University of Göttingen, founded in 1737, became a beacon of Enlightenment thought, attracting scholars who pushed the boundaries of science, history, and law. In the literary sphere, figures like Goethe and Schiller, though not directly political, explored themes of individual freedom, human potential, and the complexities of societal structures, subtly undermining the old order. Their works, often set against a backdrop of German landscapes and folklore, resonated deeply with a burgeoning sense of a shared German identity, distinct from the overarching multi-ethnic imperial framework. This cultural awakening, sometimes called the German Sturm und Drang or storm and stress movement, emphasized emotional expression and individual genius over rigid classical forms, mirroring the broader societal shifts away from established hierarchies. Yet even as these intellectual currents swirled, the empire itself remained a bewildering mosaic of over 300 independent states, free imperial cities, and ecclesiastical territories. Its institutions, like the Imperial Diet in Regensburg, continued to function, albeit slowly and often ineffectually, as a forum for negotiation and dispute resolution among its disparate members. The Diet, a permanent assembly since 1663, was a curious relic, a perpetual congress of ambassadors from the various princes and electors, deliberating on matters of imperial law, war, and peace. Its proceedings were notoriously ponderous, reflecting the inherent difficulties in achieving consensus among so many sovereign entities. Historians still debate whether the Diet's enduring existence was a testament to the empire's resilience and ability to adapt, or merely a symptom of its chronic inability to centralize power and act decisively. Perhaps it was both, a cumbersome mechanism that against all odds managed to hold the disparate pieces together for centuries longer than many might have predicted. The true earthquake, however, that would irrevocably shake the foundations of no just the empire, but all of Europe, erupted in France in 1789. The French Revolution, with its radical calls for liberty, equality, and fraternity, sent shockwaves across the continent. Initially, many enlightened thinkers within the empire viewed the revolution with optimism, seeing it as the practical application of their philosophical ideals. However, as the revolution grew more radical, descending into the reign of terror and then spilling beyond France's borders through military conquest, this optimism quickly turned to alarm. The Revolutionary Wars, and especially the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, proved to be the ultimate undoing of the Holy Roman Empire. Napoleon, a military genius with an insatiable ambition, did not merely seek to conquer. He sought to reorganize Europe according to his own rational, centralized vision. The fragmented, decentralized nature of the Holy Roman Empire made it a prime target for his reforms. In 1792, the First Coalition War began, pitting revolutionary France against a coalition of European powers, including Austria and Prussia, the two dominant forces within the empire. The early campaigns were disastrous for the imperial forces. French armies, fueled by revolutionary fervor and new tactical innovations, swept through the Rhineland. The Treaty of Luneville in 1801 marked a significant turning point, formally recognizing French annexation of the left bank of the Rhine. This loss necessitated a massive reorganization of the empire's territories, as many German princes who had lost lands on the left bank had to be compensated elsewhere. This compensation came in the form of the Reichsdeputation's Hauptschluss of 1803. Often translated as the final recess of the imperial deputation, this was a truly revolutionary act, a wholesale redrawing of the German map that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. Under French pressure, hundreds of smaller states, free imperial cities, and almost all ecclesiastical territories were secularized and mediatized, meaning they lost their independence and were absorbed by larger neighboring states. This event, perhaps more than any other single act, stripped the Holy Roman Empire of its ancient character. It eliminated the vast majority of its direct imperial vassals, consolidating power into a few larger, more manageable entities, primarily Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and Hesse-Darmstadt. The ancient tapestry of imperial immediacy, where countless small lords and cities held their rights directly from the emperor, was violently torn apart. It's a lesser-known fact that this process eliminated over 200 sovereign entities, reshaping the political landscape of Germany in a way that would endure, in many respects, for over a century. The dissolution of the ecclesiastical states was particularly profound. For centuries, prince-bishops and prince-abbots had been powerful figures, ruling their territories as both spiritual and temporal lords. Their disappearance marked the end of a unique medieval institution and drastically reduced the Catholic Church's political influence within the empire, further weakening its traditional bonds. Napoleon, however, was not finished. His ambitions grew with each victory. In 1805, he decisively defeated Austria and Russia at the Battle of Austerlitz. This victory paved the way for the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine in 1806. This was Napoleon's brainchild, a league of 16 German states, including Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden, which formally seceded from the Holy Roman Empire and placed themselves under Napoleon's protection. They were, in essence, French satellite states. Napoleon served as their protector, and they were bound to supply troops to his Grand Army. The formation of the Confederation of the Rhine was the final, fatal blow to the venerable institution. Emperor Francis II. Recognizing the inevitable, and under direct threat from Napoleon, issued a declaration on August 6, 1806. In this solemn decree, he abdicated his title as Holy Roman Emperor, released all imperial estates from their duties to him, and dissolved the empire. He declared that he was doing so to prevent the further disintegration of the German lands and to ensure the well-being of his own hereditary Austrian domains, which he had already consolidated into the Austrian Empire in 1804 anticipating this very outcome. And so, after more than 1,000 years, the Holy Roman Empire, a political entity that had traced its lineage back to Charlemagne and, through him, to ancient Rome, ceased to exist. It was not a sudden, violent overthrow from within, but rather a slow, agonizing dissolution brought about by external pressures and internal anachronism. The Enlightenment had eroded its ideological foundations, and Napoleon's military might and political reorganization had dismantled its physical structure. The news of the empire's dissolution was met with a mixture of resignation, relief, and some bewilderment. For many, especially those in the smaller states that had been absorbed, it meant the end of an ancient tradition, a connection to a grand, if often distant, past. For others, particularly the larger princes who had gained territory and sovereignty, it was an opportunity for modernization and greater power. The poet Goethe, reflecting on the event, famously remarked that he felt no particular grief for the empire's demise, seeing it as an entity that had long outlived its practical utility. This sentiment, though perhaps a little cold, captured the prevailing mood of many enlightened Germans who saw the empire as an obstacle to progress and national unity. The dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire left a profound void in the heart of Europe. For centuries, it had served, however imperfectly, as a framework for German political life, a symbol of a shared, if often contested, heritage. Its end marked not just the close of an era, but the beginning of a new, tumultuous chapter in German history, one that would eventually lead to the rise of nationalism and the formation of a unified German state, but only after decades of further conflict and transformation. The ghost of the empire, however, would linger. A complex legacy that continued to shape political thought and cultural identity in the lands it once encompassed. Its memory, woven into the very fabric of European history, would serve as a constant reminder of the ebb and flow of power, the resilience of ideas, and the ultimate fragility of even the most enduring institutions. The dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire in 1806, though seemingly an abrupt end, did not erase its complex identity or its profound impact on the European continent. Instead, it merely transitioned its legacy into new forms, shaping the political and cultural landscape for centuries to come. The empire's long, winding story, spanning over a millennium, had woven itself deeply into the fabric of Central Europe, particularly in the German-speaking lands. Its very absence created a vacuum, a longing for unity that would animate subsequent generations and fuel the eventual drive for a German nation-state. The concept of a universal empire, though never fully realized in the Holy Roman Empire's decentralized structure, continued to echo in political thought. Even as the Enlightenment championed national sovereignty, the memory of a broader, encompassing order persisted. For many, the empire had represented a bulwark against chaos, a divinely sanctioned framework that, despite its internal squabbles, offered a vision of a unified Christendom. This lingering ideal, often romanticized in the 19th century, contributed to a sense of shared heritage among the disparate German states, even as they pursued their own interests. One of the most immediate and tangible legacies was the sheer number of independent states that emerged from its ashes. The Reichsdeputation's Hauptschluss of 1803, the final significant act of the empire before its demise, had already dramatically reshaped the German map, secularizing ecclesiastical territories and mediating smaller imperial free cities. This process, driven by Napoleonic pressures, concentrated power in fewer, larger states like Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden. When the empire officially dissolved, these states, along with Prussia and Austria, became the dominant players in the German Confederation, a loose association formed in 1815 at the Congress of Vienna. This confederation, a pale imitation of the empire's former grandeur, nonetheless served as a transitional structure, maintaining a degree of political cohesion while respecting the sovereignty of its members. The administrative and legal structures of the empire also left an indelible mark. Many of the legal traditions, particularly in civil law, continued to be applied within the newly sovereign states. The concept of Reichsrecht, or imperial law, had for centuries provided a common legal framework, and while it was superseded by state laws, its principles and precedents often informed subsequent legal codifications. Similarly, the intricate systems of taxation, justice, and local governance that had evolved within the imperial territories continued in many regions, adapting to the new political realities rather than being entirely swept away. Culturally, the Holy Roman Empire's influence was perhaps even more pervasive. The empire, despite its political fragmentation, had fostered a shared German identity, albeit one that was more cultural and linguistic than political. The flourishing of German literature, philosophy, and music in the 18th and 19th centuries, often referred to as the German classical period, occurred within the geographical and cultural space once defined by the empire. Figures like Goethe, Schiller, and Beethoven, though subjects of individual states, contributed to a broader German cultural consciousness that transcended political boundaries. The empire's long history provided a rich tapestry of myths, legends, and historical narratives that fueled this cultural awakening, offering a sense of common ancestry and destiny. The debate over the empire's true nature and its historical significance continues to this day. Was it a failed state, perpetually weak and unable to centralize power effectively? Or was it a remarkably resilient and flexible political entity that adapted to changing circumstances for over a